Past President Skip Kotkins is only 6 months shy of 40 years in our club and has provided tremendous leadership to this year's task force, the Strategic Options Task Force. Do you remember all of those table talks and the survey about member preferences? Skip was instrumental in leading that effort. He is also our first story on surviving COVID-19. It's my pleasure to welcome Skip Kotkins to today's program.
Thanks, Kim. By the way, that song, Lean on Me, Bill Withers, who wrote it, I don't know if you noticed, but he passed away just a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
One of the sort of the great songwriters of our time. Anyway, so this is, remember in fourth grade how I spent my vacation? There I am, I'm back. How I spent my vacation. This is kind of how I spent my 9 nights as a guest of Virginia Mason. First, some facts. My wife and I were visiting our children and grandchildren in New York City. And we returned to Seattle on Sunday, the 15th of March. My wife had a bit of a fever, and I just felt as though I was having my annual chest cold. By Wednesday, the 18th, my wife's fever had not gone away, so we called our primary care physicians at the polyclinic, and they said to come in and get tested, which we did. On Friday, the 20th, they called to tell us that we had both tested positive for COVID-19. They told us to self-quarantine, and if things got better, to call our doctor. Wednesday, the 25th, 5 days later, yes, things had not gotten better. So we called the doctor. We were both feeling short of breath. My wife still had a fever, and we had this unbelievable sense of malaise. We just didn't want to move. So the doctor told us to go to Virginia Mason, and he said, that's because if you have to be hospitalized, they have more capacity than some of the other hospitals. So we dragged ourselves out of the house and drove to the ER at Virginia Mason. They took my wife and me to separate rooms and started going over us. After they finished, they told me that my oxygen blood concentration was 71. Now, if you know anything about that, 95 and up is considered normal. So that was really not very good. And they looked at my chest x-ray and they used one of those technical terms. They said, your lungs look like a mess. Don't you love when they get technical like that? Anyway, at that point, my wife came into my exam room, told me her lungs were fine. So I gave her the car keys, gave her a kiss goodbye. She went home, and I was admitted to what they call the progressive care floor, which is one step below the intensive care unit. They put me on oxygen, supplemental oxygen, and antibiotics to treat what they told me was viral pneumonia brought on by COVID-19. I've got to tell you, I've never had any respiratory issues in my life, so that was really quite surprising. The first point I want to make, and many of you probably know this, is that there's a big difference between oxygen and ventilators. Ventilators essentially put a tube down your throat and the machine breathes for you. I had a hose in my nose pumping supplemental oxygen into me, and that's a big difference from a ventilator and more comfortable, certainly. I'm told that far more patients at this point need the supplemental oxygen than those that have to be intubated and put on a ventilator. I was grateful that the doctor assigned to me told me the truth. He said, you are only the 20th patient we've seen, so we don't have a lot of track record. This is perhaps the most important point I want to make today. Nobody knew very much for sure. So if it looks like doctors or even the CDC didn't have a firm handle on things, it was because they didn't. They just didn't know. And to make matters worse, this virus manifests itself very differently in different patients. My wife had a persistent fever. I had no fever. My lungs were a mess. Hers were not. So as far as I can tell, the only universal symptom that everybody says they have is a loss of taste and a loss of smell, and then that total lack of energy when even walking across the room feels like it would be a huge effort. Otherwise, symptoms, duration, and intensity are all over the place. So while hindsight wants to be 20/20, we need to give those dealing with it at the time some slack because they just didn't know that much. So the big question we keep asking is, well, now that we've had this and we're past it, we're immune, right? It's got to be a silver lining somehow. Well, again, they just don't know. COVID-19 is one of a number of different coronaviruses. Based on what they know from prior ones like SARS, they think that having the disease creates antibodies that give you future immunity. But they don't know that because there just haven't been enough patients go through the process where they can study the antibodies and know for sure. So even today, there remain a lot of unanswered questions. I learned another thing. I was making nice progress in the hospital. The amount of oxygen they were having to give me was going down. I was starting to feel a little bit better. And then at about 4 days in the hospital, I got hit hard. I got a fever. They had to increase my oxygen concentration. I just felt like, you know, fill in the blank with your term of choice for really unpleasant. It was demoralizing because I felt like I was on the upswing. After a few days, that second wave of symptoms subsided. While it may not be true of everyone, I've learned that I was one of a significant number of cases where the worst of it doesn't happen until about 7 to 10 days in. I think that's what happened to Boris Johnson in England, for example. It's unexpected and it's really scary when that happens to you. The bad news is, that's the bad news. The good news is when you get past it, you truly are on the path to recovery. That's what happened to me. I came home on Friday, the 3rd of April, and have been largely symptom-free for the last week or more. But my wife and I are definitely not there yet in terms of getting all our energy back. So a few final points. Number one, after being really annoyed that my children were constantly reminding me that because of my age, thank you, I was in a high-risk category. Well, they got it too. So they had it pretty bad with fever and other issues. So this is not just for us gray hairs. Number two, I am really a fan of the folks at Virginia Mason. From the moment I stepped in the door, I felt safe and well cared for. And even though they admitted that they didn't know that much about how to treat this thing, they did a terrific job. And I never felt that they were worried about being around me, who was obviously a really contagious agent, contagious patient. So hats off to all those healthcare workers. Number three, I can't say enough about my wife, Jackie. I was in the hospital, surrounded by great care, room service on call, even though I didn't have much of an appetite. She was home alone, dealing with having to get through this thing all by herself. She was really terrific, and thank goodness for video chats. There were 18 beds on the floor I was on at Virginia Mason. The max number occupied during any time I was there were 3. And at one point, I was the only patient on that floor. Now, with the recent dismantling of the field hospital at Century Field, there could be some folks complaining that maybe we overreacted. Maybe we cried wolf. And while we'll never know for sure, I think that what they anticipated easily could have happened. But because everyone took it seriously, we did flatten the curve. So please keep it up. Finally, I lost about 12 pounds in the hospital that I really needed to lose. But definitely it's not the diet I would recommend for anyone. So even those of you who want to lose some weight, keep up the good work and stay safe. And that's what I did on my vacation at Virginia Mason.
Thank you, Skip. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you, Skip. Thanks for all that you do for Rotary, and we are so glad that you and Jackie and your family are recovering and mostly recovered. Thanks again for being here today. Now for a brief announcement from SRSF and this year's campaign co-chair, Tom Mesaros.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's see here. I'm not quite unmuted yet, but I think I'm unmuted now. Good. So we have a little bit of a slide, and I'm going to ask Mariah to put the slide up. There it is. So I have three things I want to remind you about, and this is really, it's our club that has done this. So Kim was gracious to talk about the foundation, but the foundation and the club we're tied at the waist, we're tied at the head, we're tied together in everything that we do. So the club has, through the donations that we received through our last drive, we decided to allocate $100,000 to the foundation's, the Seattle Foundation's COVID-19 response fund. And I misspoke there for a minute, because these funds, this 100,000 is really out of the foundation's reserves. So they aren't from the dollars that we just received. Those are going to be used for some of the traditional things that the foundation does. But this 100,000 is from all of you, all the members of this club that we've had in our reserves. And so it's just great that we're able to respond to this. And this fund has raised, I think, over $18 million so far. And so by pooling our funds with others, we can make a great impact on what's going on with COVID-19 and the impact it's having on a lot of non-for-profit organizations throughout the greater Puget Sound area. So the other thing I want to mention is that we also gave $5,000, and that did come out of our current funds, $5,000 to support one of our members' mask projects, and that the mask that we purchased with that $5,000 is going to the Seattle Fire Department. And that was well received. I wish I could have been involved in the delivery of those. It would have been fun to see the recipients actually get them, but it's important that our first responders have the protection they need as they work with folks who have become ill with COVID-19. And the last thing I want to mention to you is this $5,000 that we decided to allocate for the project that Carl Egge and Liam Lee's mass project. And you heard about that through Liam at our last meeting last week. And this is one that's interesting, is that the foundation board has decided to allocate the $5,000 up to $5,000, but we want to ask members to contribute toward that to defray that $5,000 cost. So we don't know if people will do that or not do that. We may be able to raise $1,000 toward that, and so we'll use $4,000 from the foundation's funds, and then plus the $1,000 that we've contributed. But there's going to be something in the totem on this, and so do read the totem, and it'll give you a chance to contribute something toward that last $5,000 that you see on the slide. So it's nice that our members have reached out and they've acted on their own, and our foundation can support the work of our members. And it's also nice that we can pool our funds with other philanthropic endeavors across the Puget Sound region and be a part of this big fund that the Seattle Foundation has put together. So my essence today is thank you. And again, Seattle 4 has stepped up and is part of the solution when our community needs a solution. Kim, back to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And just for those who don't know, SRSF acted very quickly, unanimous decision on the 100K. They did excellent work, and they were very expeditious. So we thank you, Tom, and all of the trustees at SRSF. Now to our main program. Do you know Ken Grant? Do you only know Ken Grant as perhaps the longest serving Sergeant at Arms? If so, that would not be a surprise, as Ken has served 8 presidents. Did you also know that Ken's expertise is in branding? For more than 20 years, Ken has been helping companies build and reposition their brands around their most important asset, their people. Today, more than ever, the world needs servant leaders, people who put their needs after the needs of others, or as we know it, service above self. But how do we actually do it? Is it an inherent skill, or can it be learned? How do you know if you are already doing this? Here to present us with 10 steps to becoming a servant leader, please welcome Ken Grant.
G'day, I'm Ken Grant, and today I'd like to share with you some really fun thoughts about becoming a servant leader. So let me lead off with this question. Ever had a bad boss? I'm sure we all have, unless you're really young, right? We've all had that boss or two that like, oh, don't even mention their name. Think about it though. Having had that experience with a bad boss, is there a chance that you picked up on some of those bad habits and brought them into your own version of management? I used to have a teacher when I was a young kid, 19, violin teacher. He was so mean, so strict, so off the charts. That was my very first impression of what I would consider a bad boss. And some of those bad tendencies have gone with me to this day. Now let me ask you the second question. Have you ever had a great boss? Hopefully you have. I have. I had a great experience. When I very first moved from California to Washington, I was leaving music behind. I'd done it. I'd been there, done that. I was like, I got to have a new career. Moved up to Seattle. Didn't have anybody that I knew to stay with. Had to start a whole new fresh career. And oddly enough, this is a little known fact, oddly enough, I was a receptionist. I got a temp job and they said, listen, we love your accent. You're going to go and answer phones. Like, you know, God bless receptionists, but that was not really a job that I wanted to do. So in my past, in California, I had also been a TV reporter. And I was inquisitive. I've always been inquisitive. So I started asking around every single person in that office what it is that they did and what it is that they like to do and what it is that they thought could be done better within the company. Well, the boss got wind of this and she pulls me aside one day and she goes, what's this I hear? You are asking my staff all these questions about themselves. I'm like, I told her the truth. I said, well, I don't think receptionist is really where I need to be. This is a part of my past and this is what I've learned. She goes, well, what have you learned? I said, well, half the people here don't want to market. She goes, well, what would that mean? She came back a week later and I had to present to her my thoughts about a marketing plan. I'd never done one in my entire life. I'm making this up as I'm going along. And she goes, that's great. You know what? I like it. You start tomorrow marketing, you get the office next to mine. That was one of the most incredible moments in time where someone was such a servant leader, to such the degree that she would believe in somebody and she knew I'd never done it. And I saw her a few years ago and she goes, you know, I still use your materials to this day. You know how that made me feel? Her perception of me, her ability to just see something that I didn't even see, walks with me to this very day. Part of that then has influenced how it is that I see the world and how I personally treat other people. So let's start the 10 layers of being a servant or becoming a servant leader. And I'm going to start at the very, very top. This is, to me, it looks like a funnel. I want to start with what I call the leader's oath. One of the things we notice in life, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is that there are lots of people surrounding us that don't seem to deserve being a leader. They don't deserve being the manager. How in the world they even got to there, we're not even sure. But they fumble through it. And we're going to sort of see that show up many times in today's conversation. But we built an oath to really get people's minds around, I am a leader. I understand the awe-inspiringness of what it is that I bring to the table, how it is that the people around me, I'm responsible for them, right? I am responsible for those people's well-being, their mortgage, their dog care, their daycare. That's my job. I have very few things, but as a leader, and I'm responsible for that team, I'm responsible for them and their well-being. So we put this oath together, and I want to share this with you, and I want to see if you will take it with me. And if it doesn't stick, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about it a little later on. Here's how it goes. I, fill in your name, understand the roles, responsibilities, and awe-inspiringness of being a leader of people, to be the one whom they respect, who listens, who has their back. I'll strive to be a better leader than a manager. I'll never take the gravity of my role as a leader for granted. If you know that you're a leader, you need to appreciate what that means. Doesn't mean it goes to your head. It almost means it goes to your heart. So we want to start there with taking the manager's oath. So let's go to layer 2 of the 10 in our journey through to becoming a great servant leader. To me, it's one of the most important in the entire 10, and that's being and offering dignity and respect to those around you. Listen, the reason we go to work is to be treated like an adult. The reason we go to work is because we want to be part of something bigger than ourselves, right? The reason we go to work is that we can be part of a team. And if your boss does not treat you with the dignity and respect that you deserve, therefore you may not be treating those around you with the dignity and respect that they deserve, then all bets are off. Why would somebody be loyal to you? Why would somebody show up every day and work harder than the day before, right? Think about this for a reason. The number one reason for kids abuse in the US right now is neglect. Parents just don't show dignity and respect to their kids. Same thing at work. It's not that hard. Let's think about it. Do I offer dignity and respect for those around me? Well, if you think back to your bad boss experience, that was probably the number one thing they did not do. They treated you like the what's it on the bottom of your shoe. They didn't give you the time of day. They didn't respect you. They didn't treat you well. They didn't treat you like an adult, right? So that's why we start with this. But I'll also give you the kicker, is that we also have to understand how to treat ourselves with dignity and respect, because if we can't start with ourselves, it's almost impossible to share that outward. So it's a yin and a yang to this. Dignity and respect for ourselves, dignity and respect for those around us. All right, layer number 3, what I call 360-degree communications. What is that? Well, if you're a manager or a leader in a company, you want to make sure that you always know what's happening, where the company's going, why it is that you're doing something. But that goes the other way. You need to be making sure that you give that information also to those people around you. In all the years that I've been building brands, it starts with a lack of communication internally. Listen, marketing directors around the world can put out millions of dollars, billions of dollars worth of ad campaigns, but if I don't know internally what's happening and why I do the thing, that this nugget goes with this thing, then why do I even get up? Why do I even go to work? I got to know why and where it is that I'm going. Historic maybe is important, but where it is that we're going and why it is that we do the thing that we do. Very important. So that being holistic around communications, I think is so important. It also drives to the bottom line of the brand, right? I'm a huge proponent that you are the brand that represents this company. You're the number one person. You may be the only person I've ever met. Therefore, you are the brand. The more information you've got about the company that you work for, then the higher degree that you have of showing up, representing that brand as part of your persona. Here's another important one. That's the ability to have empathy and compassion for those around you. Listen, not sympathy. Let me get way ahead of this conversation right now. Not sympathy. The last thing we ever want is sympathy. Oh, the poor, ever been in that? Of course you have, right? You're like, I don't need your flipping sympathy. I'd like you to be compassionate to what I'm going through. Not, the little violins come out. I want you to be empathetic about what I'm going through, right? We've all heard the notion of what does it take for me to be in your shoes? That's exactly what we're talking about. I heard a great story once. I was teaching this class, and a gentleman in the class, we get to this point and he goes, I think I get exactly what you're talking about. I'm like, go ahead. He says, I had a woman on my team who was just, something was going on. Something was not, whatever was happening, it just did not seem like her. He had the courage to go ask, permission-wise, can I ask what's going on? He had built enough trust over time, like, yeah, you know what, I feel embarrassed about this, but I will share with you, I had a miscarriage. Opportunity. Am I sympathetic to that? He can't be sympathetic. He's never gone through this and he never will go through this. But can he be empathetic? She doesn't need to be, she didn't ask, like, I don't need to be, I just wanted to share with you, this is what's been going on. This is why I may not seem like I'm on my A game. I'm okay with you knowing that. He then took the responsibility to go, how do I take care of you? How do I look after you? Well, I'd really like to take 2 weeks off and just sort of process this because this is some heavy stuff. He did. Anything that she wanted, she got because he was just being empathetic. He was being compassionate to the situation. Did they lose money? Did the company close down? Nothing of that. He just led with his heart and was smart enough to go, you know what? Whatever you need, you've got it. That's the pure definition of empathy and compassion. If we can do that, that's one of the greatest layers of being a spectacular servant leader. Let's move on to number 5. We're flying through these. Number 5 is also really important. That's transparency. Listen, if you're around in the 80s, that was the last thing anybody ever thought about was transparency. It was always, hey, we've got this, we've got a deal for you, right? Transparency now shows up in, listen, I didn't like that company. They mistreated me. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight to Glassdoor and I'll show you transparency, right? The whole world is so different now that we don't have a choice but to be transparent. Back to what I said a minute ago about how it is and where it is that we're going. Transparency can show up in any ways, but if I sniff for a second that you're hiding something behind me, or if you're doing something, or where you're sending us into battle to do something that is irregular, that's not transparent. That's hiding something, and we'll just take care of that fast. That's the greatest thing about social, right? Social media allows us, particularly Glassdoor inside of companies, to go, listen, I don't agree with that. And I'm going to show the world that I don't agree with that. And lots of companies are like, oh my God, I can't even control the narrative about what people are saying. Well, you can control it by being transparent, by offering people in your company the ability to show up every day as being magnificent. Okay, another one of my very favorites is the ability to listen to learn. I'll break this into 2. The ability to listen is also an art form that seems to be going away, right? You've had a conversation, you're in a conversation with your boss, and they keep on wanting to cut you off. They keep on thinking that they've got this crystal ball and they can answer the rest of the question or the statement that you are making, right? Have you gone through this? The challenge is that we also do it ourselves. I find myself doing this with my kids, and it is the worst thing in the world. How about I let them finish their thought process? I don't know where their thought process is going. They might go left, they might go right. But unless I am willing to listen to the whole thought process, I don't know what's going to happen. Same at work, right? Our ability to listen is so important, but our ability to listen to learn is even more important. What am I learning about this person, right? We're going to talk about one of these in a second. What am I listening for? Are they complaining to me? Well, let them complain. Let them finish. One of the tricks that I learned years ago was there's 2 ways to have a conversation with someone. One is if I know somebody's gonna like just dump on me, I'm gonna ask them a quick question first. Would you like to just dump on me, or would you like me to come up with a solution? Whoa, nobody ever asked me that before. Great. Which do you want? I just need to dump. I need to get this off my chest. I need to. Great. Let them get that off their chest. Let them finish and thank them for their time. There's no judgment. There's no interplay. There's nothing. Like they just wanted to vent. You let them vent. The other option, though, is they want to fix. They want to vent. How are you going to fix this? Well, now that you've said this, and I heard you say this, this, and this, if I'm correct, yes, now I can start coming up with solutions. And if I'm smart, I'm going to start coming up with solutions that are your solutions, not mine, right? That's the ability to listen, to learn. It's fantastic. And if you get it right, if you can just shut up for a minute, it is monumental how that person feels, again, to the dignity and the respect. Wow, they really listened to me. I felt listened to, right? Think about that. So this next one is really hard for a lot of us, and I'll put myself in this camp, and that's the ability to take our ego out of the case study, out of the situation. How did this happen? I don't understand. And all of a sudden you start, right? All because I might have got my ego involved. I might have got my feelings hurt. I might have been outside of my league. I might not have had an answer. I may not have fill in the blank. When our ego gets involved, it starts chattering so far ahead of us, and all of a sudden, all of our insecurities show up. For me, I should have had that answer. How come I didn't have that answer? As a brand strategist, you're paid to come up with answers. How did I not have that answer? Insecurity starts biting at you and your fears come out and you're like, wow. And all that is driven by your ego. A great servant leader, on the other hand, will understand that it takes a village, right? If we're learning something through this, and if there's a theme through this entire conversation, it takes a village. It takes a village to be heard. It takes a village of dignity, right? It takes a village of respect. It takes a village of just being understood, Now we're at level 8. You can see these funneling like I started the conversation with today, like they get heavier and deeper, but they all start to make sense. They're like a mathematical puzzle. Number 8 is being courageous. Having the courage, taking back the fear, taking back the ego, having the courage to make a decision, having the courage to look after everyone around you. Right? Having the courage to step up and ask questions, to get to know people, to get their trust, and thusly you trust them. And sometimes we have to make really hard decisions in this world, which take a lot of courage. One of the great things about a servant leader is that they can then look at all the pros and cons. They can look at all the data around them and then make that decision to the best of their ability. They don't make it off the cuff. They don't run around putting their head down in the sand. They don't run around screaming and right like it was your fault, it was everybody's fault, and everybody. They have the courage to stop, take a breath, process, and make a decision. And if you think that is easy, then I'm going to have another conversation with you. It's one of the hardest things in the world is to make a definitive, calculated decision, particularly when it's around those around you. Now you start to understand why transparency is so important. Oh, I didn't see that coming. Really? We talked about it. We were very open about that. Back to communications. Everything we talked about was leading to this thing. Now remember before we talked about asking, listening, right? I had asked you a million times, was there something going wrong? No, nothing's going wrong. And all of a sudden you're leaving and you're like, you never listened to me. Everything I did was trying to listen to you. Everything I did was asking you questions. You can't throw this back on me, right? If we have done everything else we've talked about, that courage, that courageousness will show up in a way that no one is surprised. Yeah, you know what? I feel good about this. I'm being led through this thing. As bad as it's going to be, I'm being led with courage. I'm being led with dignity. Now let's get down to the 2 crunches. Remember before I said that this was like a mathematical puzzle. We started with an oath. Do you believe that you are the leader necessary to lead? Plug in everything else. And if you've been taking notes all along, you will notice now that if you can do all the things we talked about, you now are showing up as a servant leader, right? And one of the definitions of being a servant leader is being empowered, but empowering everyone else. Being there, but basically being invisible. Putting your needs behind the one of your team, right? As a matter of fact, it's sometimes funny to me that we even use the word leader, because the leader should be out the front. That's just sort of how we were raised. But the leader in this case is always in the background. There's no ego. It's just compassion. It's just joy for those around you. It's trusting those around you. It's understanding those around you. It's having everything that we've talked about right there, here, to go, you know what, I think we've got this. As a matter of fact, I know we've got this. Which leads us all the way to number 10. The whole point to doing this is that we create such an amazing and extraordinary sense of employee engagement. Employee experience. That's the buzzword, right? We want to have a great employee experience. Well, I'll tell you what, buying someone a great big sofa and letting them bring their dog in on a Friday and giving them, the pool table in the back is all well and good. Fluff pieces. Because, and here's the whole point to all this, if you have a bad boss, you have a bad boss. Pool table, dog on Friday, flip-flop Thursdays, fill in the blanks. You have a bad boss, you'll always have a bad boss. You can't change that. A pool table does not change that. So my offer to you is, if you can think about in your leadership role to be that servant leader, then you have, in essence, created such a magnificent, open environment, transparent and everything else we've talked about. That is an environment that an employee wants to be part of. So we started today's conversation about taking that leadership oath. And I said at the time, if you weren't sure if that was really for you, like you couldn't feel it, I'm curious now if you can feel it. If you have going through these layers of experience, this journey to get to being a great servant leader, let's repeat it and see now if it starts to make more sense. I, fill in your name, understand the roles and responsibilities and awe-inspiringness of being a leader of people, to be the one whom they respect, who listens, who has their back. I'll strive to be a better leader than a manager. I'll never take the gravity of my role as a leader for granted. Yeah, I bet you're starting to feel that you've really got this now. That's awesome. So I will leave you with this. Thank you so much. I'm Ken Grant, and here is to your continued success.
Thank you, Ken Grant. There are so many leaders on this call today, and I hope they all appreciate seeing this detail, which I have never seen before. Ken, thank you for our program in addition to all you do for Seattle 4. We are grateful. So now we're going to take questions via the chat box. Please enter your question and Mariah will facilitate and Ken will answer.
All right, so first question is coming in from Virginia McKenzie, and the question is, what advice do you have for when it's necessary to give critical feedback to a team member?
It's a good question. Well, for one, I think I'd start that conversation inside of the courage that we talked about. Never stray away, because the more we put our heads in the sand, the more that is not accomplishing anything. That is not transparent to the person we need to talk about and need to talk to, right? I think it's important that we get that thing clear. When we talk about trust, I think that's part of it. There's been a lot of people being fired this week, last week, the week before, fired versus furloughed. My wife, for instance, she went through this. She kept her job, but many people around her lost her job at REI. She watched in the last couple of days where person after person after person after person wrote into the group saying, I'll miss you, it's been great, I love it. Not one word of bitterness. So although someone leadership-wise, that tough conversation, the fallout to that has been absolutely, it's been astonishing to me. I'm in love with that brand so much already. That can't have been an easy, it's not an easy conversation. It's never an easy conversation. But somehow someone had that conversation and the repercussions have been good. So I would never be fearful of that. I'd keep everything above board, but you know you have to have that conversation.
Okay, Ken, you're coming through really choppy. I don't know if you have any options for better internet connections where you're at, but
I don't.
We will keep going with questions and hopefully we'll be able to keep hearing you. So let's see, next question's from Dorothy. And the question is, how do you counsel a boss who you flagged as a failed servant leader?
So this is going the opposite direction. How do you go up to a boss? You might want to start with this video. That might help them. It might help them a little bit. Good question. How do you have to think about that? That's a really good question. I think one thing that you might want to keep in mind, when we talked before, in my presentation, we talk about the ability to listen. There's also the ability to be heard, right? You might be able to go to that person and say, listen, I want to share with you just my thoughts around what's happening, right? Let me just share, may I share this with you? I've got 2 points, right? So you're controlling the narrative, control the fact that you've already got 2 points in this case. I want to share this with, I just want to get this off my chest. This is difficult for me. Trust me, super difficult. But I just want to offer this as a response to whatever's happening. That would be at least a start that I would offer.
Okay, great. So next question is from Jan. What impact do you think all the remote working will have on being a servant leader?
I tell you what it's doing to me. I was already an introvert, although the ward thinks of me as an extrovert. It's making me even more of an introvert. Like I see people on the street, I'll say hi, but I cannot pick up some massive conversation. It was already sort of like that for me, but it's getting worse. I worry that that's going to happen to a lot of people. The introverts become more introverted. The extroverts have already been so hungry that that has maybe hit them in the side of the head, like, oh, do I really, right? So I'm not totally sure. What I also worry about a little bit, I'm no expert for sure about the whole virus thing, but what I worry about is how long it will take us to be physical, how long it will take us to trust doing a high five or a handshake, right? And I think there's such amazing, and we see this in our club all the time, right? There's such amazing physicality to that. Like the high five to me is fantastic. And you see me do it throughout the club all the time. It's just my way of communicating. It's my way of bonding. You have to wonder if we start to question that, and I'll take that, our club, to your question about just in the general workplace. Do we start to question, did somebody sneeze? Is this thing really gone? I don't know, I can't try, right? The other part is like, I kind of get used to working at home. I kind of liked it. This is nice. My wife, for instance, back to her, she's an hour commute one way from Edmonds to Kent, 2 hours a day. She doesn't have to worry about now. Do I really need to? I kind of figured this out. So I don't know. Do we go back to work? I guess is the other question.
Okay, so let's do one last question and maybe keep it quick if we can because we went a little over time. From Jane, how do you help leaders be more courageous?
Again, show them the video. I think courage is super all over the place. One person's courage is so different than the other person's courage. We look at people around us, stars, rock stars, movie stars, leaders in industry, like, wow, that took a lot of courage. But if you think about it, we've got our own sense of courage. I think it's all very, very different. I was really scared to do this thing today because I'm in front of people. All my friends, like, oh, is this thing going to be any good? I don't know. I had a little bit of extra courage, and I presented this thing. I didn't have to. I could have run for the hills. I didn't have to do anything. So part of it, I think, is just sort of looking at your own level of courage and being okay with that. And maybe the next time you add a little bit more out of courage. You can't compare courage. I don't think that's a thing. You can't compare and contrast. Somebody else's courage is like, whoa. But I did this thing today. And tomorrow I might just take on a little more. So I think that's how I see courage.
All right, thank you very much, Ken.
Yes, thank you very much, Ken. We appreciate your courage and thank you for our program today. Now, please stay online after my closing remarks if you'd like to visit with your Rotary friends in the chat rooms. And today's question is there anything that you wish Rotary were doing right now to help our community? That will be the question in the chat rooms. I'd like to thank everyone who made today's program possible, especially the behind the scenes people, actually up front and center now on Zoom, Mariah Kimpton and Caroline Bovanek, our program manager and executive director respectively. Please join us next week when we will hear from John Hextra of Mountains to Sound Greenway. In addition to the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, John will provide our first report from the front lines of the nonprofit world. Please join us next week when President-elect designee Jimmy Collins will lead our program. And now I'd like to say, please stay engaged, stay safe. Your community and your fellow Rotarians need you. We are adjourned.